Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. This is our first episode on the dependence response to the problem of freedom and foreknowledge, and our guest is Trenton Merricks.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Trenton Merricks, Commonwealth Professor of Philosophy at the University of Virginia. Trenton specializes in metaphysics and has written whole books on persons, truth, propositions, and more. He's also written a couple of papers on truth and the topic of this season of the Free Will Show, namely freedom and foreknowledge. The first of these papers, Truth and Freedom, was published by Philosophical Review in 2009, and the second, Foreknowledge and Freedom, was published in the same journal in 2011. These papers, I think of them as breathing new life into an old idea that the key to the freedom and foreknowledge puzzle has to do with the notion of dependence. And that's what we're going to be talking about in our conversation today. So thanks so much for joining us, Trenton. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on these issues related to free will?
Yeah. So you summarized a lot of it. I work on lots of different things in metaphysics and also philosophy of religion and some other areas. I think for the free will stuff, I wrote a book called Truth and Ontology that really focused on, different pictures of what the world would have to be like for certain claims to be true, how truth depends on the world, a bunch of things like that. And a couple years after I'd finished that book, I started thinking that some of the ideas explored there could have application to freedom and fatalism in the first instance, and then also to foreknowledge. So I would say I became interested in the stuff you want to talk about. I didn't come at it through the kind of free will front door. I came at it through the truth depends on the world back door. And so I see the papers you're talking about really as building on the stuff in Truth and Ontology. So that's how I got thinking about these issues. Yeah.
Nice.
Cool. In your paper, Truth and Freedom, you begin with what you call a truism about truth, namely that truth depends on the world, which is what you were just talking about.
Yeah.
Could you explain what you mean or what it means to say that truth depends on the world and maybe give a few examples?
Yeah. So it really is meant to be a truism. It's meant to be totally uncontroversial. And the thought is, it's true that I'm talking to you guys because I'm talking to you guys. It's true that the earth is round because the earth is round. It's true that dogs bark because dogs bark. And maybe for our purposes, an interesting one is it's true that there are no unicorns because there are no unicorns. And the reason I say that's kind of interesting is you might think when I say it's true that the earth is round because the earth is round, you might think there's this object, the earth, and a property it has. And that's what makes it true. That's what that truth depends on. But that's a stronger thesis than I think the truism needs to be. And when I say it's true that there are no unicorns because there are no unicorns, I think everybody ought to agree. I mean, unless you believe in unicorns, I'm going to set that aside. So when I say it's true there are no unicorns because there are no unicorns, everyone should agree. But I don't think in order to agree with that, you have to endorse what I think is false and what we should all think is much stronger thesis that there's this object in the world, there being no unicorns, that truth depends on. So when I say truth depends on the world, I'm not saying, for example, there is some object X, the world, whose existence necessitates all the truths. That would be a kind of a truth maker thesis and a really kind of funny one at that. All I just mean is a shorthand summary of there are no white ravens is true because there are no white ravens. There are no unicorns is true because there are unicorns. It's true that dogs bark because dogs bark, and so on. Is that enough to start with?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess that kind of leads into the next question, which is, it might seem obvious, this mere truism that truth depends on the world, but you think that truism undermines the threat to free will from, well, as you mentioned earlier, the threat having to do with logical fatalism, but also from divine foreknowledge. you cite Origen of Alexandria, this early church father, who says it will not be because God knows that an event will occur that it happens, but because something is going to take place, it is known by God before it happens. And then you say, similarly, God has certain beliefs about the world because of how the world is, was, or will be, and not vice versa. So could you say a little bit more about how the idea that truth depends on the world is supposed to undermine the threat to freedom from divine foreknowledge?
Yeah. I mean, in a way, you've run two things together. You've run the Origin quote, which is that God's beliefs depend on the world,
Mm-hmm.
and which is important, I think, in handling foreknowledge and free will. You've run that together with truth depending on the world.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there are definitely ways to connect them, and we can talk about that if you want. But I think probably to talk about foreknowledge and free will most directly, I would want to maybe say, let's focus on God's beliefs depending on the world. That is, God believes there are no unicorns because there are no unicorns. God believes that dogs bark because dogs bark, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
We focus on that instead of truth depends on the world. And we can come back to tie that with truth depending on the world if you want to later.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So my thought is, what is the threat to human free will from divine foreknowledge? It's something like this. Suppose God knows right now that you're going to eat pizza tomorrow. And then you think, well, God can't be wrong. Maybe if you're a philosopher, you think knowledge entails truth. So even if Matt knows I'm going to eat pizza tomorrow, then I'm going to eat pizza tomorrow. But the thought is, you think God can't be wrong. So the thought is something like, at the very least, God's believing that I'll eat pizza tomorrow necessitates that I eat pizza tomorrow. It's impossible both for God to believe I'll eat pizza tomorrow and me not to eat pizza tomorrow. And so you might think, so I'm not free. And so I think the first, everything can be made fancier, but the first sense, first kind of gut reaction where you think maybe free will threatens foreknowledge is this idea that God's beliefs about the future necessitate what I'll do. And then you think, well, how can I be free then? Let's just kind of set that aside for a second and think about God's beliefs about what's going on right now. So God believes right now that I'm talking to you guys on a podcast. God can't be wrong. So necessarily, if God believes right now I'm talking to you guys, then I'm talking to you guys. Most people don't think that. Well, I'll just throw it out there. I think if foreknowledge is a threat to freedom, God's beliefs about what's going on right now are equally a threat to freedom. At least they're alike in that God's beliefs necessitate my actions.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that people worry about foreknowledge ruling out freedom in a way that, to my knowledge, nobody's written an article about God's, knowledge of the present ruling out freedom? I think it's because we realize, God's beliefs that I'm talking to you guys necessitate that I'm talking to you guys. But of course, my talking to you guys, assuming God exists necessarily and is essentially omniscient, which let's just assume for the argument. I like that view anyway. My talking to you guys necessitates that God believes I'm talking to you guys. So necessitation goes both ways. It's not that interesting, I think. And I think we can intuitively add why God's belief right now that I'm talking to y'all does not rob my freedom. And it's something like this. There's a reason God believes I'm talking to y'all. And that's because I'm doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not the case, let me add this, that I'm talking to y'all because God believes it. So there's an explanatory relation there from what I'm doing right now to what God believes about what I'm doing right now. And it goes, I think, from my actions to God's beliefs and not the other way around. We could put it this way. God's beliefs about what I'm doing right now depend on what I'm doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think if we assume, and I think you're going to come back to this at the end, so that'll be lovely. If we assume that I'm free right now, we should assume that I have a choice about talking to you right now, that I'm doing this freely. And so it's sort of, I'm free with regard to that part of the world that God's beliefs depend on. I have a choice about that. And I think that means God's beliefs, I have a choice about them. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you think that's okay in the kind of present tense case, I think this is, Merrick's view, Trenton's view. I think you should say exactly the same thing in the foreknowledge case. God believes that I'll eat pizza tomorrow. Why? Because I'll eat pizza tomorrow. In that case, God's beliefs about my future free actions are different than some facts about the future. Maybe 1,000 years ago, it was true that God believed I'll eat pizza tomorrow. I think I have a choice about that because I have a choice about what it depends on in the way we've just been talking. Mm-hmm. But take God's belief 1,000 years ago that, I don't know, no helicopters are invented yet. I don't think that has anything to do with I don't think I have a choice about that. And partly why? Because the explanation of why does God believe that has nothing to do with any of my actions or any of my free actions. So I guess to summarize your response, what's the point of God's beliefs depending on my actions? That is God's beliefs depending on the world, and so God's beliefs about my actions depending on my actions. What's the role there? It's that the initial challenge to free will from God's beliefs can't just be that God's beliefs necessitate actions, because of course our actions necessitate God's beliefs, and that goes both ways. Necessitation. It's got to be something like what's doing the explanatory work. That is, what depends on what? Is it that our actions depend on what God believes? I think that would be a real threat to free will. Or is it instead that God's beliefs about our actions depend on our actions? And my claim is if foreknowledge is in that instance no more a threat to free will than God's believing right now that I'm talking to you means I'm not talking to you freely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In your view, God's beliefs about human behavior have this dependence relationship.
Yeah.
It might sound at first like what we do causes God to have certain beliefs in the past, but you deny that there's any kind of backward causation involved. So could you say a little bit more about the nature of this dependence and how it works?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are all kinds of dependence relations that aren't causal. So, I mean, here, I'll say a bunch of standard stuff. I think it's true. I don't know. People say these things. There are sets. Sets are abstract objects. Abstract objects don't enter into causal relations. Suppose all that's right.
Mm-hmm.
Take the unit set of me, the unit set of Merricks. It's an abstract object, doesn't enter into causal relations. But I do think it exists because I exist. That is, the existence of the set of any concrete object depends on the existence of that object. So there's all kinds of non-causal dependence relations. If you want a story about, that's one thing. So the mere fact that I say God's beliefs depend on what I do doesn't mean it has to be causal. Mm-hmm. Here's a second move. If you really want to know what the relation of dependence is in the sentence, God's beliefs about what I'll do tomorrow depend on what I'll do tomorrow. What does depend on mean there? The best I can do and be confident that there's no mistake is to say it's exactly the same as this. God's belief that I'm talking to you right now depends on my talking to you right now. Mm-hmm. And if you're willing to spot me that, which I think you should, then I'm going to reason with that and say, well, it's up to me whether I'm talking to you right now, so it's up to me that God believes that. And then I'll do the same thing with the foreknowledge case. If that makes sense. So that's the second thing. Doesn't have to be causal. I can give you an example of the dependence relation that I think should be uncontroversial about the right now. And we should be able to see in the right now doesn't automatically rule out my freedom. Mm-hmm. Maybe the third thing I'd say is here's a mechanism I'll throw out there just for fun. I don't know if it's right. Suppose you think a proposition is, I think suppose truth depends on the world. So a proposition is true because of the way the world is. I don't think that the cause there or the dependence there is causal. So the proposition that there are no unicorns is true because there are no unicorns. I definitely don't think there is this thing, there being no unicorns, that causes that proposition to be true. That seems to me, and I think that relation can kind of hold, as it were, backwards. I want to say it was true 1,000 years ago that someday there will be helicopters. I think that's true because of what the future will be like. Don't think that's causal. So if you give me that, then, and you want a mechanism for God's beliefs about the future, I'll just throw this out. I'm not saying it's definitely right, but it's one way you could do it without backwards causation. For every proposition, God believes that proposition. If it's true, God believes it's true because it's true. So here we just need God's beliefs depending on true propositions. And then I've just told you how a true proposition can be true and depend on what the future will be like, but in a non-causal way. So that would be a way to bring together truth depending on the world and God's beliefs depending on the world. I'll just say that'd be a way to do it without committing yourself to backward causation. In fact, being able to work around it. And there you go. That's what I got for you, I think. Yeah.
If I could ask a quick follow-up here, just to make sure this is clear for our listeners, you're thinking of this dependence relation as not causal, but also stronger than something like mere counterfactual dependence, because...
Yes. I'm thinking of it as explanatory as... And again, if you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, I don't know what this relation could be, there's all kinds of dependence relations. I'm like, look, do you think God believes that I'm talking to you right now because I'm talking to you right now? You can say no to that. And then I want, maybe you're an atheist. You don't think God believes anything. Or maybe you think God doesn't know much. Or maybe you think God's beliefs explain my actions, in which case I think there is a threat to free will there. But if you're like, no, I get that. God believes you're talking to those guys because you're talking to them. Then the dependence relation I have in mind is the one picked out right there. And then I claim God's foreknowledge is that same kind. I'm going to say, by the same token, I claim God knows I will eat pizza tomorrow because I'll eat pizza tomorrow. And if you think God's knowing right now that I'm talking to you right now doesn't undermine my free will, then I think you should, for the exact same reasons, say that God's knowing that I'll eat pizza tomorrow because I'll eat pizza tomorrow doesn't undermine my free will.
Thanks. Well, if it's all right with you, maybe we could turn now to a couple of potential objections to the dependence response. I forget which of your papers, maybe it's the first one, you say that your view differs from Ockhamism. And to be sure, we haven't referenced the Occamist distinction between hard and soft facts about the past or anything like that yet. But some, including John Fisher and Patrick Todd, have argued that the views aren't so different after all. So I'm wondering, first, if you think it would be a problem if your view turned out to be, say, like a version of Occamism, or second, if it really has to be understood that way, or whether it's really distinct.
I don't know if they've argued that my view is a form of Occamism. They say it, and then they quoted Occam saying some propositions depend on other propositions. Not right on point. But so I guess, here's maybe the real question, I think. Does Occam or Occamism add anything to Origen's insight? That truth depends on the world. Was Occam doing something new beyond, 1,300 years after Origen? If you say no, not really, Ockhamism just is Origen, then I'm sure, okay, my view is Occam,
Right.
it's fine. But I explicitly say I'm totally committed. I think I am just building on Origen's view here. But I also think, at least for 20th century Occamists, and I think for Occam too, it's false that it's just Origen's view. I think that at least maybe we're just talking about 20th and 21st century Occamists. They really do think, and in the Fisher and Todd paper, they're very clear about this. I think they think if you're going to be a good Occamist and not a cruddy one, you need to really make clear what you mean by the hard, fast, soft fact distinction, and you maybe need to say God's beliefs are soft facts and so on. So I guess I think if it's in fact true that modern day alchemists think they're doing something more than just trading on origins insight. That something more has to do with some important distinction between soft facts and hard facts. And that distinction isn't just a fancy way to talk about what depends on human free actions. If I'm right about that, then it is important to me that my view is not alchemism. In fact, in some ways, I was most excited about my view because I thought, oh, here's a way to handle these problems that's sidestepping the, seems to me, kind of morass of alchemism with really hard to define and often defined in different ways, hard fact, soft fact distinction, and so on.
Yeah.
But if you say, no, what they're really getting at is truths depending on the world. They're just trying to introduce complicated set of terms to talk about what origin said so simply, then okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm doing their view, but without the complicated terminology.
Right.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
Another objection to the dependence response, and one that's been raised in response to your work in particular, is that it only works as a response to the threat from divine foreknowledge if we assume that we have free will. That is, we must assume that we do in fact have a choice about the actions that God's beliefs depend on. John Martin Fisher and Neil Tognazzini say that this is a problem because our freedom is precisely what's at issue in this debate, and so we can't assume it.
Yeah.
Do you agree that your response requires this assumption? And if so, is that a problem?
Yeah, here's the way I would put it. It's false that what is precisely at stake in this debate is our freedom. I would say what's at stake in this debate is whether our freedom is consistent with foreknowledge. So I've never claimed any of the stuff you've read. I don't think Origin claims to argue for the fact that we have free will. It's rather to argue that it's false that foreknowledge is inconsistent with our having free will. I mean, I think of it more like this. Imagine somebody said, hey, the problem of evil, there is evil, therefore there's no good God in control. And now imagine you come up with like the, Nobel Prize winning, or maybe B. Templeton Prize winning theodicy. Where everyone's like, yes, that's it. And here's how your theodicy goes. God, a good God, has a reason for letting all the evil that's ever happened happen. And here's the reason. And then you lay it out. And everyone's like, oh, crud, that's right. That does it. I think that would be a great theodicy. I think that would answer. Now, look, notice that my answer assumed that there was a God who had a reason for letting the evils happen. And if somebody's like, you can't use that in your theodicy because what's at stake is God's existence and therefore whether God has any reasons, that would be, I think, a real mistake. It would be misunderstanding the debate. A theodicy is not an argument for God's existence. It's instead an attempt to explain why a good God would let evil happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Likewise, I think the stuff that you're asking me about in my work is not meant to be a defense of the claim that we have free will. Sorry, it's not defense is ambiguous there. It's not meant to be a positive argument for the claim that we have free will. It's instead meant to be a positive argument that our having free will is perfectly consistent with true propositions about our future actions and also God's having true beliefs and infallible beliefs about our future actions.
Yeah.
I wonder if you think this is a fair way of paraphrasing. My friend and a previous guest on our podcast, Andrew Law, and I wrote it this way one time in a paper. Like, if you think of the dependence response in the way that you're portraying it here, we should say like the threat from divine foreknowledge doesn't give you any new reason to think that you don't have free will, or the dependence response should be seen as trying to show that if you didn't already think that we lacked free will, well, you don't have some new reason for thinking that we don't have free will just by taking into account, God's foreknowledge.
I'm totally fine with that. Just like if there were this amazing theodicy, you might say the existence of evil isn't a new reason to think there's no God. But that theodicy, of course, is perfectly consistent with atheism.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And likewise here, I guess the dependence response is consistent with like impossibilism about free will or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful.
I've got one more. This one wasn't in the notes.
Uh-oh.
Since we talked with Andrew Law about the dependence response in our last season, I've been thinking about whether the dependence response is going to rule out certain conceptions of God. And if there's like I don't know if it's the classical view or some kind of view where God's not dependent on anything.
Yeah.
And you're going to be, you have to take one or the other. You can't have both.
So that's a great question. I want to be careful what I say here, because I think classical view of God is up for grabs. I will say this. I think Aquinas is very clear that our actions don't cause God's beliefs, but he also says, nevertheless, he also just quotes Origen and says, I agree with Origen that they depend on. So you tell me if Aquinas believes classical theism.
That's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, you know what I mean? I think Anselm's a little trickier. But, imagine if you say this. Suppose you said everything about God is in no way, including God's specific beliefs, in no way depends on anything that anyone does. Then I think the dependence response, the one I've been offering here, that would rule that out. I think it probably would rule out free will if you add God has beliefs about our free actions. I think like some kind of high theological, lofty philosophical, classical views about God, I think it aims to elevate God in a way, but I think it can sort of, in a backwards way, undermine the glory of God. I kind of think God's not really omniscient on that view. It's not like God's intimately acquainted with what's going on in the world and kind of always knows it. It's rather God could be this, I don't know, Greek notion of this being that like out of God emanates all the facts in the world. Mm-hmm. So I guess I think if you think it's great for a being to have to be omniscient, and if you think omniscience really is knowing things about something, I'm inclined to think that that's going to want the being's beliefs to be dependent on how things are.
Yeah.
So I think it's just all super complicated, But yes, obviously it's part of the picture I'm painting that God's believes that I will eat pizza tomorrow because I'll eat pizza tomorrow. And if you say absolutely not, you'll eat pizza tomorrow because that's what God believes, then the dependence relation won't work. Dependence response won't work. Mm-hmm. And I personally think there's probably a pretty good argument against free will from that picture. But we'd have to look at it. You got to get the premises out there. The fact that my response doesn't work doesn't mean that no response works,
Right, yeah.
But I myself am inclined to think it would probably undermine free will.
Yeah.
But honestly, we haven't talked about this at all. And I think it was important for me that the papers you asked about didn't require incompatibilism. Mm-hmm. If you're one of the reasons why I think the foreknowledge and the fatalist arguments, you can almost smell that they're going to fail, is because they would rule out compatibilist views of free will as well. They just rule out free will. Mm-hmm. And compatibilism seems like it should be pretty much not ruled out by that stuff. If you were a compatibilist and you thought your actions depended on God's beliefs, then maybe you would think it was a threat to free will. Mm-hmm. But if you're the kind of incompatibilist who thinks something like the, Carl Genet and Peter Van Inwagen's no choice argument is a good argument, then you're probably going to say, I have no choice about what God believes. Necessarily, if God believes, then I'll do that. So I have no choice about doing this. Mm-hmm. So maybe the more, I'm sorry, this wasn't one of the questions you gave me ahead of time. So I had to reason it out on the fly. Whether this view of God, where our actions depend on God's beliefs and not vice versa, rules out free will, I would say maybe, given the validity of the no choice argument.
Right. Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, and we've talked with Peter Van Inwagen about his consequence argument on the podcast before, right? Yeah, so that's a good connection to make. If I can ask one more unscripted question, thing that I think...
What I was calling Van Inwagen's argument the no choice argument, but you're right.
But you were thinking of the same one, right? Yeah.
Same one.
Yeah.
Same.
some of our listeners might be interested, even though we're focused on foreknowledge here and not like models of divine providence, how the dependence response might link up with different views of divine providence. And so kind of on the like really strong view of providence end of the spectrum, you have something like God determining everything that happens.
Yeah.
And it seems like that might be inconsistent with the dependence response. But on the other end of the spectrum, on the more kind of open view where maybe the future is open, and not only does God not kind of directly control it, but he lacks knowledge of what will happen in the future. That too seems inconsistent with the dependence response. So I know there are a couple options in the middle. We talked in our last episode about Molinism. Another view is just that God has foreknowledge, is sometimes called the simple foreknowledge view, but doesn't seem to add much in by the way of providential control. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the dependence response and then these models of providence.
Well, you said in these models of providence, I mean, maybe the open theist view is there is no providence. So that's and maybe the really, I don't know, hardcore God causes everything that would, again, if you think the consequence argument is valid, probably free will is in a lot of trouble. I mean, that's a big if. Not everybody thinks it's
true.
Mm-hmm. I'm inclined to. I enjoy defending Molinism here. I don't know if it's right, but I do think the objections to it are bad, and I do think it delivers a way to reconcile pretty robust providence with pretty robust free will. And so, insofar as, and this would be a different conversation, but insofar as the topics we've been talking about interact with providence, I would say it's fun to think about Molinism, fun to think about the counterfactuals of freedom, which are true propositions. And my response would begin by saying it's true that I would accept a bribe if I were offered one, because I would accept a bribe if I were offered one. It's crazy, I think, to say the claim that I would accept a bribe if I were offered one has nothing to do with me. I would do. And the proposition, the counterfactual freedom, is true because of a fact about me. And in fact, you could read my paper. I think it's called Truth and Molinism, for trying to tie these issues together.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for letting us ask unscripted questions.
That's all. Okay, that's great. No, I'm just embarrassed that it's just too bad everyone else knows the earlier questions were scripted. These answers right now, it's kind of well, sure, yeah.
The cat's out of the bag now.
Yeah, I think everyone knows we tell our guests some of the things we'll ask them.
I think this whole conversation is illustrated. I don't mean my views, but just the kind of the questions and the approach has illustrated what I think is maybe the best way to think about philosophy of religion. So if you're thinking about free will and foreknowledge, I think it's great to think about the really general philosophical questions that are in the background.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I think what philosophers have to offer when it comes to philosophical theology isn't, better understanding of the ancient biblical texts or, better understanding of the history of liturgy or anything. It's that these kind of specifically theological questions are instances of kind of really general philosophical questions. And the way philosophers can make progress on them, if we can, is, I think, by thinking about the kind of big philosophical issues and then applying them in the theological context. Throw that out.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Trenton. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Well, I have 3 children, and my oldest, my daughter, is a web and app developer. And for Christmas one year, she built me an excellent website.
Nice.
And
that's a very good gift.
So it's an excellent gift, yes. And she updates it for me. So TrentonMerricks.com. And if you go on there, you can get links to my books, which you'll have to buy. Or you could read them on Oxford Scholarship online for free if you have a university account. And you can also, though, get PDFs of all the papers I've ever written for free on there. So
Great.
if you're interested in my stuff, the website's probably the best place to go.
Cool.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks again.
Yeah, my pleasure.
In our next episode, we'll continue to talk about the dependence response, and our guest will be Philip Swinson, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the College of William and Mary.